Welcome to Econ Nerds Live. Today we have an interview with Professor Richard Sylla, who is Professor Emeritus at NYU and an expert, among other things, on Alexander Hamilton. So today I thought we would just do a deep dive on Hamilton. So welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming on, Professor.
Thank you, Matt. I'm very glad to be with you.
So I guess let's start with the beginning of the story. So let's start with Alexander Hamilton as a young man. So he's born in the West Indies, and then he comes to the U.S. And so I guess, could you give us a sense of, say, the differences between the West Indies and the American colonies at that point in time?
Well, they're both part of the British Empire, at least the island that Hamilton was born on, the island of Nevis. Today it's a part of a nation called St. Kitts and Nevis. St. Kitts is a bit larger island, about a half-hour motorboat ride from Nevis. Hamilton was born there probably around 1755. Basically, these West Indian islands were sugar colonies. They produced sugar. 90% of the population were probably slaves, and then there were some white overseers running the plantation. A lot of the plantations had absentee ownership, that is, people back in Britain owned them, and they employed people to run them. And Hamilton was born on that island. And we're talking about opportunity. There wasn't really a whole lot of opportunity there. There was commercial traffic. Obviously, they had to import a lot of things to feed the slaves and clothe them. And then they exported sugar, which was valuable in Europe. But that was about it. It was very much of a small island, and it had nothing like the mainland did. The mainland, where people had been settled since the early part of the 17th century, by that time, the mainland had a sort of diversified economy. It had a sort of plantation economy in the south, but in the middle colonies, they grew a lot of grain in that, and there was a big trade between places like Philadelphia and Baltimore, Georgetown, with the West Indies. And the colonists also established colleges and universities. And so you had in New England and the Middle Atlantic, mostly, you had a number of colonial colleges, like Harvard was the first, Yale was the second. I should mention William and Mary, which I think was William and Mary was the second college, and Yale was third, I think. And these were established quite early in colonial history. So, it was a very different environment. They were all British colonies. And so Hamilton was a part of the British Empire when he was born. But when he left Nevis to go to first Boston and then quickly to New York, he was just moving within the British Empire.
Yeah, there's this idea from Acemoglu and Robinson about extractive versus inclusive colonies. And so their theory is you have these colonies that are based on extraction, which would be like the West Indies, where, okay, we have like a small elite, and the goal is to basically move the wealth upward. And then you have more inclusive colonies, which are like settler colonies, like the north of the U.S., that are much more equal. And their idea is okay, these differences in colonies determine long-run growth. Like the inclusive colonies are much better for long-run growth because they are more meritocratic, and they have mobility. To what extent do you believe that theory, and to what extent is that true even in that time period? And so is it the case that these northern colonies give more opportunity than where Hamilton started?
Definitely, I think so. I'm glad you described it that way, because you made me think now that Hamilton was moving from an extractive place of his birth, a small island that produced sugar, and most of the people on the island were slaves. He moved to an inclusive colony, New York, and where you had a wide diversity of people. There were slaves in New York at that time. A lot of Americans sort of don't know or forget about the fact that there were slaves in virtually every American colony, but they were a tiny part of the population in the northern colonies. And so Hamilton was moving from an island that grew sugar to a rather diversified economy with a lot of mercantile activity, not just focused on international trade. That's what the West Indies did, but there was a lot of internal trade within the U.S. along the coast and so on. And so Hamilton was moving into a much more diversified economy.
And so what's interesting about this is long time ago, over 250 years ago. And yet the story is very similar to one we might hear today, where it's okay, Hamilton is coming from a place where he has limited opportunities, but he's a talented young man. And so he immigrates to the U.S., and he immediately distinguishes himself via education, right? So he goes to King's College, and then, which is present-day Columbia, and then he finds himself on Washington's staff during the Revolution. Is that right?
Yeah, that you described it pretty well. I think the puzzle for even people who studied Hamilton a lot, like, how did he learn so much so fast? He didn't complete Columbia, because he dropped out to fight in the Revolution. So he arrives in New York maybe in 1772. He's obviously very bright. That's what people noticed in the West Indies. And so they thought he should be sent to the mainland to further his education because he seemed to be such a promising young man. And so he starts studying I think for a year, kind of privately in New Jersey, sort of what we might call high school today. And then he tries to get into Princeton, but he kind of offends them by saying he's in a hurry and he wants to complete their 3-year program in 2 years or their 4-year program in 3 years. And Princeton basically said, no, we do it our way in Princeton, and we're not going to do it your way. So then he enrolls in Columbia, but he's only there for 2 to 3 years. And somehow by the end of those 2 to 3 years, let's say 1775, Hamilton is writing, he's probably not even quite 20 years old yet, very, essays, 20, 30, 40-page essays on why the American colonies are being mistreated by Britain. And sometimes they're an answer to a fellow who was writing the opposite, saying that the Americans should behave themselves and be glad they're part of the British Empire and forget about these revolutionary thoughts. And Hamilton is just on the other side. He's a young man. He can't contain himself, so he has to reply to these other people. Anyway, the essays that he writes, one is called A Full Vindication of the Measures of Congress. These were when Congress was trying to cut back on trade with Britain to protest Britain's high-handed treatment. So there's the Full Vindication of the Measures of Congress that he writes, and then the other one is The Farmer Refuted. There was somebody who wasn't a farmer. I think he was an Anglican clergyman, but he wrote his essay and said he was a Westchester farmer, and Hamilton replies to him in an essay called The Farmer Refuted. And this is around 1774, early 1775, just before Lexington and Concord, before the American Revolution gets started in a militaristic way. The essays show some people at the time thought there must be some very mature American patriot, somebody like Benjamin Franklin or John Adams who would write these essays. But no, it turned out they were done by this 19-year-old kid. And he had arrived in America about 3 years earlier. And how did he learn so much so fast? He must have really had the kind of mind, which I've encountered a few times in my long academic life, that can just sort of like a sponge, absorb knowledge and retain it. But I think that's one of the issues that is puzzling to even people who spent a lot of time studying Hamilton, how he could learn so much so fast and retain it.
Yeah, what's interesting is like how much this echoes the present, where in this time period, they're arguing back and forth in these newspapers and it's all anonymous. Kind of like online today, you're arguing with someone and you don't know who the other person is. And
Right.
it could be like a 15-year-old from India or something like that. And in this
Sure.
case, it's a 19-year-old from the West Indies who's
Right.
somehow knows all these things. What was surprising to me reading some of your work was exactly what you said. How did he know so much? And so by the time he's on Washington's staff, he has a very developed idea of what the financial system of the future United States should look like. He's a big proponent of banks. So do we have any idea? So he just must have read something, or because he doesn't travel, like it's not going to the Netherlands or he's going to England and observing how finance works there. He just seems to absorb what the right financial system looks like.
Yeah, I can describe his path there. I mean, Hamilton is in the New York Artillery, and it's said that he first meets George Washington, who's the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Hamilton's New York Artillery Unit becomes a support group for the Continental Army in what's called the Battle of Brooklyn. Sometimes it's called the Battle of New York in late 1776, and that battle does not go well for the Americans. The British kind of rout them, and they're pushed up to the northern part of New York City, and then finally they suffer a defeat, and Washington has to scramble across New Jersey. And I think this is when Hamilton first becomes noted as somewhat of a distinguished soldier. This 20-year-old guy, maybe 21 by now, is leading covering Washington's retreat. And if you go to Rutgers University, by the oldest building there is called Old Queens, and they have a marker there. It's on the edge of the Raritan River, and it says at this spot, Alexander Hamilton in 1776 put his artillery, his cannons, and held off the British who were coming chasing Washington across New Jersey, and covered Washington's retreat. And Hamilton really did such a good job of it that he got to have a bit of a military reputation. And then people, when they saw Hamilton, who was a very slightly built guy, he was about 5'7", apparently weighed 130, 140 pounds. They couldn't believe that this person who was touted as such a commanding military figure could be this somebody called him a stripling, a young lad, a stripling, a mere stripling. But anyway, he's with Washington's army. He fights again, part of the New York artillery. He's part of the battles of Trenton and Princeton. And by this time, George Washington learns about Hamilton, or learns that he's one of the high performers in the military. And so he invites Hamilton to be on his staff. And Hamilton accepts that. And for the next 4 years or so, he's George Washington's right-hand man. Later in life, George Washington said, Hamilton was my principal aide in the American Revolution.
One, was Hamilton really reticent to accept that position like it's portrayed in the musical? And then two is like, as his role as the right-hand man, is his role really more writing letters? Like, it's portrayed, he wants to be the military general. But how much of his role was really understanding economics to fund the army? Can you kind of walk us through what was he really doing?
Well, I think, Hamilton had obviously a, first-class brain, and a couple of other generals in 1776 had heard about him and invited him to be their aides de camp. But Hamilton turned them down because he wanted to be a soldier in the field, not a glorified clerk. But he couldn't turn Washington down. But he still had this ambition to be a hero in battle. In the end, he's going to become that at the Battle of Yorktown, where he leads several hundred troops on a mission in the night to capture a British redoubt, which he did it effectively. The French were on his flank, and that they captured another one. But it was those particular victories, he capturing these outer fortifications at Yorktown, that led the British to surrender. And interestingly, you can read that Hamilton predicted that. When he was successful, I sometimes think he almost got himself killed there, and I wonder how American history might have been different had Hamilton died on that mission. But he predicted before the British surrender that they would have to surrender, and a day or two later, the British did surrender. So as to how he learned what he did, I think Hamilton was the guy who would say, there's a problem. We've got a problem here. Our army is undersupplied, but we're fighting on our home territory. So he had written about this in his earlier essays, before he got involved in the military, what the strategy should be. And it was basically what they call a Fabian strategy, that the Americans had all the advantages of fighting a revolution on their home turf. They didn't necessarily have to go out and beat the British in the field, but they had to keep their army together and wait them out. And that's called the Fabian strategy, after some Roman general who used the same thing. You don't fight to win, you fight not to lose. So Hamilton was an early proponent of that strategy, which George Washington adopted. Fighting at that time was a kind of seasonal thing. You fought in good weather. In the winter, you hunkered down and kept the army together. What this did was leave a lot of time for Hamilton to continue his studies. And I think he read a lot. The biographers talk about the different things. I think they get a little bit of it wrong in the sense that they identified, he read David Hume and Malachi Postlethwaite. I think I've identified the book that he read that probably had the most influence on him, which was Sir James Stewart's Principles of Political Economy. We know that Hamilton read that book. In fact, I proved it by showing that some of the stuff Hamilton writes in 1780, 81, the letters where he's outlining his financial ideas, he sort of paraphrases James Stewart. You can see that the words in Stewart are the same thing that Hamilton is writing in his early financial essays. So I think he studied a lot, and he asked himself, why is this war going on so long when we're fighting on our home territory? We have a lot of advantages there. And he concluded that the reason was that the British were much better financed than the Americans were. And that wasn't saying a lot, because the Americans were notoriously underfinanced. A lot of people don't know that the American army had to actually confiscate a lot of property from Americans late in the American Revolution. because they were not supplied by Congress financially, and so they just had to take what they needed, and they gave receipts for what they took, which later were converted into securities and became part of the national debt. But Hamilton was really upset by the fact that the Americans were so underfinanced, and that sort of guided him to study financial history, and he noticed that the Netherlands had become sort of the leading economy of the 17th century because they developed institutions like stock markets and corporations and public debt. And he also noticed that even though they had become the richest country in the world probably in his time, and Amsterdam was the world capital market, later on it would be London. Today it's sort of New York, with London a close second. So Hamilton knew about that from his reading. And then he noticed that the British themselves had a lot of financial innovations in the late 17th and early 18th century. The Bank of England was founded. The British national debt was stabilized a little bit. They were founding corporations as the Dutch did. The New York itself was a product. Initially, it was New Amsterdam, and it was a colony that was established by the Dutch East India Company and the Dutch West India Company. Henry Hudson of the Hudson River was an English navigator, but in 1609 he sailed for the Dutch East India Company to explore trading possibilities with North America. So Hamilton knew about this, and he learned from what the Dutch did and what the British did. That formed his ideas, and then he read Sir James Stewart, learned a lot about European financial systems. So by 1779-80, he's equipped to write these very kind of essays about financial development. In one of them, he calls for a central bank. He even calls it the Bank of the United States. This is 10 years before he's actually going to be in a position to found a central bank, but he has learned a lot of financial history. And so he learns this in the American Revolution. And he also, interestingly, besides the financial stuff, he analyzes the political problems of the United States. And he is the first, as far as I know, in a letter in 1780 to say, we have a lousy system of government. The best thing to do is to call a convention of the states to come up with a better plan of government. This is in a letter in September 17. Of course, 7 years later in Philadelphia, that's exactly what happened. And guess who wrote the call for the Philadelphia Convention? It was a product of the Annapolis Convention in September 1786, and Hamilton attended that, and he drafted the call to the states to ask Congress to ask the states to call a meeting in Philadelphia in 1787 to, I think, not to raise too many eyebrows. They said to revise the Articles of Confederation. But of course, when the people got to Philadelphia, they just sort of forgot about the Articles of Confederation and wrote a new constitution. So Hamilton learned a lot while he was a soldier. It's because being a soldier was part-time work, and so it left him a lot of time to study. And his sponge-like mind absorbed a great deal. A lot of people do that, but we don't always know what it means, or what the interpretation is. One of the reasons I admire Hamilton is he could kind of outline a problem and think about a solution, and he was usually right in his analysis of the problem and the kind of solutions that you should come up with.
Right. So I want to go to that Constitution and the new central government, but I have to ask you about something that you mentioned so you're saying the army funds itself by essentially expropriating property from citizens, and then the citizens then get securities. So how does this work? Does George Washington come to my house, take 3 pigs, and then I get a receipt like George Washington owes me 3 pigs at some time?
Well, the officers in charge of these property seizures from American citizens would probably say, we're taking your 3 pigs, and here's a receipt for 3 pigs, and Congress will eventually pay you back.
Okay. So is there actual literal documents, or the documents that say this was taken, and do we have those?
One of the military officers is called the Quartermaster General, and it's his job to make sure that the army is supplied with what it needs. So the Quartermaster Generals would send these raiding parties out to when Congress was not supplying it. By the way, that was one of the things that really bothered Hamilton. Why the government, a good government that called itself a government, declared its independence, acted like a real nation, ought to be more more responsible in funding its military, and it sort of disgusted Hamilton that Congress wasn't able to do it, and so he decided that the former government had to be changed before Americans would amount to anything. And he basically worked from, I would say, 1780 to 1787. He was in the Congress in 1782 and 1783. Other than that, he was a New York lawyer, but he first met James Madison in Congress in 1782-83, and they became friends, and they were at that time like-minded. Later on, they would have a famous split. Madison was a nationalist like Hamilton and other leaders in the 17s before the Constitution was written. Some historians attribute our Constitution to these two young men, Madison and Hamilton, pushing for it.
Yeah, exactly. And then along with John Jay, they're writing the Federalist Papers, which are basically arguing for the Constitution.
Yeah, that was Hamilton's project. That was a New York project.
And so then new federal government, Washington as president, Hamilton's the Treasury Secretary. And you say basically he enacts a financial revolution over those 6 years from 1789 to 1795. Can you outline exactly what the revolution was? Like what exactly did he set up in that very short time?
First, let me define a financial revolution. It's sort of going from pre-modern finances to modern finances in a relatively short period of time. I've written, and other people have written in a similar vein, that the Dutch had a financial revolution. If you look back into Dutch history, you find that the East India Company and corporations are going to be part of this financial revolution. The East India Company, Dutch East India Company, was formed in 1602. The Bank of Amsterdam was founded in 1609. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange was founded in 1609. Somewhere in there, the Dutch West India Company that settled New Amsterdam is formed. And the Dutch were, fighting their own war of independence against Spain, and they found a good way to finance themselves by issuing what we would call modern public debt. Basically they would pay whatever interest they needed to get the resources they needed to put their armies and navies and the armies in the field and ships in the sea to fight against Spain. And they ended up defeating Spain. The little tiny Netherlands defeated Spain, which was probably the greatest European power in the 16th century under Philip II. The Dutch won, and that was sort of impressive. So Hamilton wondered why, and then he hit on the notion that it was these financial institutions that did it. And then his own enemy in the revolution was Great Britain, and he noted that they were much better financed, and so he read up on how nearly a century earlier in the 16th, the British had founded the Bank of England, and they had securities markets there, and they made innovations that made their debt more credible. So this happened after the Glorious Revolution, which was a kind of change in England from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy. Willem of Orange, the Dutchman who came over to England and brought his Dutch financiers with him, he agreed to share power with Parliament. The previous British kings thought Parliament was a kind of sideshow, and the king could do whatever he wanted. Anyway, so the British had a similar, in a short period of time, they got their debt right. They founded the Bank of England. Sir Isaac Newton was in on stabilizing the British money. There's a book in England called The Financial Revolution in England, which is dated from 1688 to the 80s. But I think the key developments were from, say, 1690 to 1720 or so.
Yeah.
So you get a lot of change. Modern finances replace pre-modern finances. And Hamilton knows all this. This is what he absorbs when he's reading. And so I think he outlines what ought to be done in those letters of 1780 and 81. And a decade later, he's in a position to do something about it. And his ideas have matured. And so you asked, what are we talking about? Financial revolution is a lot of financial change in a short period of time. If you want to be specific about it, I say there are 6 key components of a modern financial system. And if you get all those in a short period of time, that's a financial revolution. The components are this. You have to stabilize your public finances and have credible debt management. Manage the public debt so that people will buy your debt. Lend you money, basically. A government that can't borrow money, Hamilton thought, was a government that probably wouldn't last very long, because governments that could borrow money would defeat it. And secondly, you got to stabilize your currency. The Dutch stabilized their guilder, the British stabilized their pound sterling, and so you want to have a stable money. The third thing is, based on the Bank of Amsterdam, the Bank of England, you want to have a central bank. people called it then more like a national bank, but some sort of large bank that's the center of a system. And the fourth component is a banking system itself. You want to have banks making, creating credit, because that is credit is underappreciated secret of the success of the modern economic world. A lot of it is based on credit, and credit is something that based on trust, and so you have to have a that's where the good government comes in. You have to have a good, stable government in order to have an environment where people are going to trust the banks to, the banks have to trust the people to pay back their loans, and the people have to trust the bank not to go bankrupt. And then you want to have securities markets, because if government's going to issue public debt, or corporations are going to issue stock, people will buy that stock more if you allow them to trade it, in markets. And so security markets are part of this modern financial system. And finally, I would say corporations. So 6 things, stabilized government finances, public debt. That's 1. Number 2 is stable money. Number 3 is a central bank of some sort. Number 4 is a banking system. Number 5 is securities markets. And number 6 is corporations. You want to be able to form these large businesses so people can pool their capital together and basically found larger enterprises than individuals can do themselves in order to achieve economies of scale. And so those are what I call the key components of a financial revolution. And if you get them all in a short period of time, that's a financial revolution. And the amazing thing about the United States is it basically had none of them in 1787 when the Constitution was written. And by 1795, when Hamilton steps down as Secretary of the Treasury, or even maybe a couple years earlier, by 1793 or so, the U.S., having had none of them in 1787, has all of them by 1793 or 4. And so I say that Hamilton studied financial history, knew what a modern financial system was, gave one to the United States in a very short period of time. The quickest, neatest financial revolution in history, I think. And somehow this has escaped the notion of most historians.
And this financial revolution wasn't easy. It wasn't like he just did it, right? There was a lot of horse trading. Ariel, how is that portrayed in the play?
Well, the play has a great song called "The Room Where It Happened," and it's sung by Aaron Burr. So it would be, as Ariel pointed out, Leslie Odom Jr. was the original Aaron Burr, and he's apparently back at it. And this is part of it. Hamilton's first great report, Congress asked him to do, basically the U.S. has all these unpaid debts from the Revolution. We talked about those property seizures. There were actual modern-like bonds, too. All of the national debt wasn't based on the Continental Army stealing from Americans or involuntarily taking their stuff. Some of it was actual borrowing on the basis of bonds, and a lot of it was printing money. The Congress's main form of finance in the Revolution was printing continental dollars, but by the late 1770s, the continental dollar, having been overissued, basically went to almost no value. And Hamilton is observing this. And so he says that the fact that nobody trusts the money is a real problem for this country, and we've got to stabilize the money. So he's asked by Congress to do something about the debts that have accumulated, because the Confederation Congress did not have a taxing power. It had these huge debts, but it could only sort of ask the states to contribute to the national treasury. And the states had their own problems, so they didn't do it very well. And so the national debt of the United States, it was reformed a bit after the Revolution and adjusted for inflation and so on. And new securities were given to people in the 1780s, but the interest on them wasn't paid. The interest was paid, in a way, because they issued a new security to, give a person the interest on his old security. But it wasn't really money. It was just another promise to pay you at some time in the future. So when Hamilton comes into office, Congress says, we've got this debt that's been around for a decade or more now, and we haven't been able to pay it. You come up with a plan to pay it because we want to establish the credit of our new country, the public credit. So Hamilton's first great report, after he becomes Treasury Secretary in September 1789, in December 1790, 4 months later, he issues his first great report called the Report on Public Credit. And in that report, he says that basically Congress should assume the debts of the states into a national debt, and the national debt should be reformed, restructured, you might say, into a new batch of securities, which turned out to be a 6% bond, a 3% bond, and a 6% deferred bond, which would pay no interest for 10 years. I sometimes say that Hamilton was the inventor of the zero coupon bond. It was a zero coupon bond for 10 years, and then it became a 6% bond. And the old debt then under Hamilton's program, which was debated, this is where the room where it happened comes in. In the spring of 1790, there's a big debate on this, and many people are against the federal assumption of state debts. Some states had paid some of their debts, and they said, now we paid some of our debts, and now you're going to ask us to pay the debts of deadbeat states like New York that hadn't paid interest. So that was, it was a bogus argument because everyone agreed that there would be a full accounting in any state that paid some of its debts would get credit for that in this overall financial restructuring program. But of course, you couldn't be sure that that would be honored, even though it was part of the deal. The comes down to Hamilton thinking the assumption of state debts was a key to his whole program. It would lighten the burdens on the states. It would help the country to stay together more if the states weren't kind of having heavy financial burdens of their own that might lead them to go their own way. So as a part of his unification plan, unify the country by federal assumption of state debts. But some states were against it. So the famous deal that happened in June 1790, which I and others have called the dinner table bargain, Hamilton wants to get his assumption plan through Congress. Congress so far has defeated it. So he meets Jefferson on the street, and we owe this account to Jefferson himself. I met Hamilton on the street. He was, tearing his hair out because he didn't get his debt assumption plan, state debt assumption. And so I said, Jefferson was only back for a couple of months in New York and only back in the U.S. after 5 years in Paris for 6 months or so. So Jefferson claimed he didn't really understand what the issues were, and I think he was being truthful about that. But he said, I'll arrange a dinner. You come to my house at dinner tomorrow night, and I'll have Madison there, and we'll discuss this and maybe see if we can figure it out. And so they have this dinner. As best we can tell, it was on June 20th, 1790, at Jefferson's house on Maiden Lane in Manhattan. If you're ever in Manhattan,
I am on Maiden Lane almost every day.
You are? Well, did you ever see the plaque where the site of Jefferson's house was, the room where it happened? It's on the north side, across the street from the north side of the Federal Reserve Bank in New York. If you recess, it's a little bit off the street, but you'll see a plaque in the wall of a skyscraper there, and it will say, that plaque will tell you that this was the site of Thomas Jefferson's house in 1790 when he's the Secretary of State, and it's the site of this famous dinner. And at the dinner, Madison and Jefferson agree to arrange votes for Hamilton's assumption plan to come in, but they have to get something in return. And what they got in return was moving the capital of the United States from where it was then in New York City to the banks of the Potomac, close to where Jefferson and Madison and Washington lived, but there was nothing there. It was the mosquito-infested swamps, and so it would take 10 years to build this new capital. And for those 10 years, just to show that good faith, I suppose, to get some votes from Pennsylvania, they moved the capital to Philadelphia for 10 years. And that's the deal, basically. The deal was trading. Madison he himself won't do it because he's been opposed to assumption of state debts. Madison says, I can't change my vote because people think I'm a hypocrite. I've been spent the last 4 months saying we shouldn't do this. But what I can do is I can tell some of my friends down in Virginia that this will really be good for us to move the capital down to, and they'll switch their votes to support you, Hamilton. But you have to move the capital, and you have to give Virginia a little bit better deal on your whole program. And Hamilton agrees to that. Somebody said it didn't really matter where the government was located as long as it was doing the right thing. Hamilton was a New Yorker, so some New Yorkers consider him to be a traitor for agreeing to this bargain. Incidentally, the chef at that dinner was James Hemings, Sally Hemings' brother, who was Jefferson's private chef. He had taken him to France, had him trained in French cuisine, and there are even some, accounts of what the menu was at this dinner in the room, June 20th, 1790. But anyway, that was the great compromise. And then after that happened, both the moving of the capital bills got through Congress in the next month or two, and several bills that basically established the fiscal foundation of the United States. The new treasury bonds were issued and state debts would be assumed like 1 year after. And so basically that was Hamilton's first triumph. So he got the public finances and debt management right. And then in December 1790, he issues his report on the bank, calling for a Bank of the United States, a sort of central bank. And that's December 1790. And over the next couple months, Congress debates it and passes it. Again, now this is again against the opinion of Madison and Jefferson, also against the opinion of Edmund Randolph, the Secretary of State. Washington says, this Hamilton's got this bank bill and Congress has approved it, but people tell me I shouldn't sign it. So he asks Jefferson and Edmund Randolph and his cabinet for their opinions. And they say, there's nothing in the Constitution that says we can have a bank, and therefore we shouldn't do this. And then Washington says he gives their opinions to Hamilton, who basically destroys them in a very long response, which is very convincing, that it's part of the sovereign power of the United States. The Constitution may not mention a bank, but if a bank is useful to the operation of the public finances of the country, a place for the government to keep its money, a place for money to be transferred because it's going to be a branch bank with branches in different states, then it's constitutional. And this is, what they call the broad construction of the Constitution, as opposed to the strict construction. So he persuades Washington to sign the bill. So now we've got public finances straightened out. We've got the central bank established. In January 1791, Hamilton issues his Mint report, because he wants to sort of say the Constitution gives Congress the power to establish the monetary standards for the U.S. And they ask Hamilton what to do there. So he writes this Mint report. He says the U.S. dollar should be a certain amount of gold and a certain amount of silver. That's how we'll define it. And Congress basically approves that. So that's the U.S. dollar, a new currency in the world. So Hamilton now, as Secretary of the Treasury, has gotten the first three components of a modern financial system. He's stabilized the public finances, he has a central bank, and he has stabilized the monetary unit. Now, that's all he could do directly, but when he did this, the new government bonds were issued, the stock of the Bank of the United States was issued starting in 1791. Securities are there, you have to have markets to trade them, so there's a lot of trading of these securities, and the next thing you know, in May 1792, the brokers say, we have so much trading now, we have to have a better trading system. Let's meet under the buttonwood tree and draw up an agreement to have basically a club, which eventually will become known as the New York Stock Exchange, so it's established under the buttonwood tree on May 17, 1792, trade all these new securities. Hamilton's bank report actually makes the government a part owner of the Bank of the United States. And he says, in the penultimate paragraph of this report, you may have noticed that I have the government being a part owner. And that's going to be good because the bank is going to be so prosperous that the government will make a profit on its investment in the stock in the bank. And I believe that he was basically doing this to get his bank and the way he wanted, but he's also telling the states that if you charter more banks, maybe you can participate in them and you can profit from chartering banks too. And sure enough, the states began to charter more banks later on. So Hamilton he doesn't have the power to make the states charter banks, but his guidance is basically suggesting to them that you would do well to charter more banks. And right away, the states begin to charter more banks. And so you've got the banking system now. I mentioned the stock market in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, pretty soon Baltimore. They all have active stock markets. Every one of them is trading Bank of the United States stock and the federal bonds. You've got a treasury bond market now. Today, it's the largest financial market in the history of the world in the securities of one issuer, the United States government debt, which is, I think, excessive at $37 trillion. I mean, especially since half of my lifetime ago, it was only $1 trillion, and now it's in the second half of my life, it's grown to 37 trillion. But anyway, Hamilton made that possible. And so you've got the states now chartering banks and other corporations. The financial revolution is done basically by 1792, 93. None of these things existed in 1787. All of them exist, and the United States begins to grow like Topsy.
All right, so we're about out of time. Anything that we haven't touched on, or maybe you want to sum up by talking about what Hamilton would think about our current debt situation or tariff situation?
Well, I've recently wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal, and that was on Hamilton's debt policies, but also his over how that fitted into his overall system. And basically, in that piece, I argued that Hamilton would be appalled by our current situation, where we disconnect spending and revenue raising. It's partly because we don't like to pay taxes, so you don't get very far in American politics today by saying, we really have a deficit, we should raise taxes to pay that deficit. Yeah, that won't get you elected to Congress or the Senate or maybe even the president. On the other hand, we've agreed to have a world-class military, which is expensive. We've agreed to pay Social Security to old people like me, and we've agreed to cover medical bills for old people like me. And so we're not paying for that. I can understand why you issue a lot of bonds in a war, and then you have people later on pay that, because if you win the war, you're protecting their freedom and all that. So I don't think there's any issue there. But to my mind, I don't see that the government should be borrowing money now to pay my Social Security and Medicare, and then putting my children and grandchildren on the hook for paying taxes, for the money that's borrowed now. It's not like, Social Security and Medicare are not like wars. They're like current expenses, and the current generation should be paying the cost of that. Hamilton basically analyzed this problem in his last report to Congress in January 1795, just before he retired from the Treasury. He analyzed all this, and he did it in very modern terms. People don't like to pay taxes, but they like to have government programs. The problem there is that you get into a lot of trouble if you keep borrowing money to fund government expenses and you don't pay any taxes. Eventually, your debt is going to become a huge burden, and it's going to cause a lot of trouble. And he had a solution. Hamilton was not a guy to run away from. He thought Congress should be more responsible in funding the government. But his solution to it was, as I pointed out in my Wall Street Journal piece, that when Congress borrows money, it should at the same time pass a tax measure to cover at least the interest on that debt. And if it covers a little bit more than the interest, eventually that little bit more will be able to retire the debt a certain number of years. Hamilton was pretty good at math. He once said, if you had borrowed $1 million and levied it, and the interest rate was 6%, $60,000 a year in interest. But if you levied a tax of $70,000, then you would be able to have that extra $10,000, buy back some of the debt, and you would be able to retire that debt in 25 years, something like that. So he did the math and all that. And his solution, which he recommended over and over, he hit on it in a footnote to one of his Continentalist essays in 1781, the bright young man. The footnote says, Congress could probably borrow money in better terms if it would sort of put a tax to pay the interest on it when it did borrow the money. More formally, in the Public Credit Report of 1790, and again in this valedictory report of January 1795, he says, the way to make public credit immortal, that was his term, is to, whenever you borrow the money, at the same time levy a tax to pay at least the interest on that money. And then people will buy your bonds, forever. I think we've gotten so far from that now that, there's some risk in coming years. It probably won't be a problem for an old guy like me, but for you young people, we could have a fiscal crisis in the United States because we're not willing to pay our debts now. And Hamilton told us how to avoid that, but we're sort of ignoring his advice.
Okay, well, that is a terrible place to stop. The coming fiscal crisis, as predicted by the architect of the American financial system. But that is where we'll have to stop for today. We're out of time. Thank you so much, Professor Sylla, for being a part of Econ Nerds Live.
I have one thing now.
One thing. Go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
I have a suggested conclusion. Okay, so you can cut that part. But
yeah,
I think we should raise a virtual glass to Hamilton. So would you like to propose a Hamilton toast for us to end on?
Well, I would say to fiscal responsibility.
Fiscal responsibility.
To fiscal responsibility.
Fiscal responsibility appears to have gotten lost in the woods, but we should go out and look for it and bring it back.
If only we could bring Hamilton back and put him in charge, right?
Yeah, the guy did quite a bit in a life that didn't last 50 years even.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. And for listeners out
I
there, we'll
enjoyed it.
see. Yeah.
Am I officially a nerd now?
I think being able to cite a footnote in a Hamilton letter makes you.
Yeah, those guys, they usually didn't have footnotes, but Hamilton did put in footnotes. But they were very lax on, giving the sources of their information. Today a professor is supposed to have a bibliography and footnotes and all that, and they didn't do that. And if people continually rediscover something that's been discovered much earlier in history. They read Hamilton's report on manufactures, and economists who have read some Adam Smith say, hey, I saw that in Adam Smith. And so they think they've discovered, for the first time that Hamilton is repeating arguments of Adam Smith, but actually it's been known for a long time. But I say that Hamilton's report on manufactures is probably the first extended commentary on Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. And he likes some parts of it and he disagrees with other parts of it, but he's a critic, he's an admirer, but also a critic of Adam Smith. So if you want to, see Adam Smith's influence on Alexander Hamilton, just read the report on manufactures.
Okay, well, I expect everyone to do that for next week's pod.
Right.
All right.
Next
All right,
week,
thanks
the
again.
follow-up.
You've got your assignment now.